History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of Oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 576th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost Tours for the Theater of the Mind. I'm your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we're heading to a ship. We love our naval ships.
Yes, we do.
This one's a big one. It was suggested by our listener, Karen Miller, the USS Forrestal.
I'm so looking forward to bringing this to the listeners.
Got a lot of ghost stories to go with this one, although it doesn't actually exist anymore. It's been scrapped, so we can't visit it.
Terrible.
Before we get into that, we want to welcome into the Spooktacular crew, Rhonda.
Thank you so much for joining our Facebook group.
And now this moment in Oddity.
The moment in Oddity was suggested by Lynn Beasley. In Glasgow, Scotland, back in 1525, the Archbishop Gavin Dunbar was frustrated about reivers on the Anglo-Scottish border. Reivers were raiders, and Dunbar issued a 1,069-word curse, which was delivered from every pulpit in the diocese. The ranting curse was part of an excommunication of the reiver families, although they were not said to be religious people, nor did they respect sovereign law or moral authority. I won't read the whole curse, but here is just a portion. I curse their head and all the hairs of their head. I curse their face, their brain, their mouth, their nose, their tongue, their teeth, their forehead, their shoulders, their breast, their heart, their stomach, their back, their womb, their arms, their legs, their hands, their feet, and every part of their body, from the top of their head to the soles of their feet, before and behind, within and without.
Wow, he covered it all. Even the hair on his head?
But wait, there's more.
Oh.
That was only 79 of the 1,069 words written in the curse.
Oh my gosh.
The Archbishop then goes on to curse every aspect of their lives. In 2001, there was a piece of artwork installed at the Millennium Gallery in Carlisle, England. It was created by Andy Altman and was designed by artist Gordon Young. The piece is a 7.5-ton granite boulder that is engraved with approximately 383 words from that historic curse. Since the installation, the stone has been blamed for an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, major Carlisle floods, and several other local tragedies. For centuries, humans have put pen to paper to document their frustrations, seeking solace. But penning a 1,069-word curse upon enemies and then having an art installation featuring that curse centuries later lead to tragedies certainly is odd.
Grab your slippers, hot chocolate, flashlight, and maybe even that baseball bat.
And now this month in history.
In the month of February, on the 9th in 1943, U.S. forces secured Guadalcanal, marking the end of the 6-month campaign. Guadalcanal is one of the southern Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. During World War II, it was the site of clashes between Allied and Japanese forces both on land and at sea. The Battle of Guadalcanal was codenamed Operation Watchtower, and on August 7, 1942, Major General Alexander Vandegrift launched an amphibious assault with approximately 6,000 Marines. They surprised 2,000 Japanese defenders on Guadalcanal. While making land, the Marines were strongly supported by both the Navy and Air Force. Within 36 hours, the U.S. had secured the airfield on Guadalcanal and the harbor on Florida Island. Over the next several months, intense fighting ensued, including major naval battles like the Battle of Savo Island and the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. After enduring severe losses, Japanese began evacuating in late January 1943. During the span of the battle, the Allies lost 29 ships and 615 aircraft versus Japan's 38 ships and 683 aircraft. The Allied victory of the Guadalcanal Campaign was a crucial turning point in the Pacific theater, demonstrating the strength of the U.S. military.
The USS Forrestal was one of the largest aircraft carriers ever built. She served for nearly 4 decades before being decommissioned in 1993, and then she was scrapped in 2015. During the Vietnam War, the carrier experienced a devastating tragedy with bombs on board the ship that led to several fires and over 100 men dead. And because of that, stories of ghosts on the ship have been told about her. One particular ghost was known as George. Join us for the history and hauntings of the USS Forrestal.
The first new design for an aircraft carrier in decades is currently being built in Newport News, Virginia. This is the Gerald R. Ford class. Newport News was the birthplace of CVA-59, a member of the Forrestal class. She was ordered in 1951 and commissioned in 1955 and would be the United States' first supercarrier.
Oh, a supercarrier.
Now, we've been on an aircraft carrier that I thought was huge. Imagine how big this thing is, being called a supercarrier.
Indeed.
So CVA-59 was the Forrestal's original name. Of course, we know all naval ships have a letter and number name that's different than what everybody calls it. The largest carrier in the world up until that time was the Japanese carrier Shinano, and now the Forrestal would surpass it. Since this aircraft carrier was the first in the Forrestal class, the carrier took on that name, with its namesake being James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense in the United States. And I actually asked you to ask Jared, who is our naval expert.
Yes.
Because I was like, is that the case with all of these ships I've started noticing? It seems like the first one that's made of that class is actually named that class's name.
Correct.
And he said, yep, that's the way it goes. James Forrestal was sworn in under the Truman administration on September 17th, 1947. I learned something with this. I had no idea that we didn't have a Secretary of Defense until World War II. Isn't that strange?
Oh, indeed.
He served as Secretary of the Navy during World War II and guided it through its final year. The Cold War was a real test for the new position, and President Truman and Secretary Forrestal had many differences over budget. He eventually left office in March of 1949 and tragically died less than 2 months later. Forrestal is often included as one of the most notable Secretaries of Defense, and that's why this class of carriers was named for him.
Many innovations were added to this new aircraft carrier: a steam catapult, an angled flight deck, and an optical landing system. The carrier was 1,067 feet in length. Isn't that weird that the curse was 1,069 words?
I was just about to say that, because when I saw the number, I'm like, that's almost the same number that she just said for the moment, Oddity. Pretty darn close, only off by 2 feet.
So as I started saying, the carrier was 1,067 feet in length and was powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers and 4 Westinghouse-geared steam turbines. The Forrestal was followed by 7 big-deck conventionally powered carriers that would serve the country for 54 years, until the last one, the Kitty Hawk, was decommissioned in 2009. The aircraft carriers that followed these would be nuclear-powered. The Forrestal could carry nearly 5,000 enlisted men and 552 officers and 85 aircraft. She spent much of her initial training in the Caribbean under Captain Roy L. Johnson after launching on December 11, 1954. The Forrestal's first duty was to hang around the Mediterranean Sea during the Suez Crisis, just in case she was needed. Her first NATO operation was Operation Strikeback, which took place in the North Sea. This took place over a 10-day period and was a simulation of an attack by the Soviet Union on NATO members. This included Navy warships and aircraft from the countries of the Netherlands, Norway, Canada, Britain, France, and the United States. The USS Forrestal was one of the 200 ships on site.
King Hussein of Jordan was one of the first dignitaries to visit the carrier, and this took place in 1959. The Forrestal and a C-130 would make history in November 1963 with 21 full-stop landings and takeoffs. This set a record for the largest and heaviest airplane to land on an aircraft carrier. And what that did is opened up a huge spectrum, because imagine the cargo you can put on a C-130. So they were able to bring that in to a carrier. And it was very fitting, because you have a super carrier and now you basically have a super plane to go together, and they made a record there. In 1964, Operation Brother Sam was the United States helping with a military coup against the Brazilian president at the time. President Lyndon Johnson sent the Forrestal as support, and the coup was successful and led to a 20-year-long military dictatorship in Brazil. In June of 1967, the USS Forrestal was sent for duty in the waters off of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. The next month, a tragic fire would kill many sailors.
Before we talk about the fire, we need to share a little background about the bombs that were on board on the Forrestal. The Forrestal had been stationed at Yankee Station in the South China Sea and was taking part in a bombing campaign against targets in North Vietnam. This was the longest and most intense bombing campaign in U.S. naval history at the time. The Forrestal was running out of bombs. The carrier met up with the ammunition ship Diamond Head. On board that ship were Fat Boys. These were Korean War-era surplus that had thinner skins and thus were more sensitive to heat and shock, and their older Composition B explosive was more volatile because of its age. Nobody wanted to mess with these Fat Boys because they were too risky, but the USS Forrestal was desperate for ordnance, so they took on 16 of these Fat Boys. They also had Zuni unguided rockets that had to have electrical pigtails connected at the catapult to prevent malfunctions and accidental firing. Ordnance officers didn't like how much time it took to launch, so they didn't hook up the pigtails. So what happens next was almost inevitable.
The fire on board the USS Forrestal was devastating. It started in the morning around 10:53 when a Zuni rocket shot across the flight deck from a plane parked on the starboard side of the carrier. The rocket struck an A4 on the port side, so basically think of this plane, it's on kind of the back corner, and it shoots across the flight deck and hits the plane that's on the other side. 400 gallons of jet fuel poured out of the A4, and at least one of its bombs fell to the deck. Chief Aviation Bosun's Mate Gerald Ferrier, who was the head of the firefighting crew, got on scene within a minute. Can you imagine? I mean, he was there within a minute, and he started fighting the fire with a handheld extinguisher.
Oh my gosh.
All he had right then.
Wow.
The first of the hose crew arrived about 30 seconds after that, and they got salt water pouring on the fire. Unfortunately, that bomb that dropped to the deck exploded 30 seconds later and decimated the fire crew. It took out the first two that got there. A few seconds later, a second bomb exploded. If you can envision this as well, so we have a bomb that's dropped off that plane, so it's still got another bomb on it, and then there's planes that are parked on either side of it. They are all loaded up with bombs as well. The aft end of the carrier would be rocked by 7 more explosions in succession within the next 5 minutes. 40,000 gallons of jet fuel fed the fire, so there was no stopping it. The 2-inch thick armored flight deck, this is the top of the line, this is the most elite that they've had, was no match for the explosions, and holes were punched through it in several places, and flaming bits of metal and fuel poured down into the compartments below, most of which were crew berthing areas. So now imagine you've got a bunch of sailors down there that are sleeping, and all of this just comes pouring down on top of them.
Oh, it's horrific.
The fire on the deck was contained within an hour, but the fires below deck raged until the next day. When all was said and done, 134 sailors and airmen died, and 161 others were seriously injured. Damage exceeded $72 million, which is $415 million in today's dollars. And you think about all of that damage, they were still able to repair it, and it went on and served
That's incredible.
Many years later. But yeah, it was because, as always happens with this stuff, let's just kind of skip a safety thing because it's such a pain in the butt.
Yeah, we want to be able to fire them off quicker.
Yeah, so when they did that investigation, they found out because they weren't hooking it up with the pigtail the way they were supposed to, there was some kind of a spark or whatever, and it just, bam, automatically sent that bomb firing as if the pilot had fired it.
So, I have a fun fact about the fire.
More, we don't need any death statistics about fires right now.
Oh, shucks. Okay, how about this? John McCain was aboard the ship when the fire took place, and this was shortly before he became a prisoner of war.
Okay, we'll take that.
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
Tragedy and fires would continue for the USS Forrestal through the decades. In October of 1968, an aircraft went off the angled deck and hit the water nose first and then flipped onto its back with 6 crew on board. 3 were recovered and 3 died. A catastrophic fire erupted while she was moored in Norfolk on July 10, 1972. Investigations found that a crew member started the fire that forced firefighters to cut a hole in the flight deck and pour hundreds of gallons of water throughout the carrier, which caused her to list, and some feared she might capsize. An A-7 Corsair II from VA-81 crashed on the flight deck on the evening of January 15, 1978, killing 2 deck crewmen. This was due to a miscommunication with the pilot thinking he was okay to land, and he realized too late that he was mistaken, and the flight deck was full of other aircraft. He injected in time and lived with only minor injuries. On June 24, 1978, LCDR T.P. Anderson was killed when his A-7E Corsair II crashed into the sea during a practice bombing mission. There are plenty of reasons for this carrier to be haunted.
There were good times, though, too. A really cool thing earned the Forrestal the distinction of being the largest naval warship ever to come up the Mississippi River. Can you imagine seeing a super carrier coming up the Mississippi River?
Absolutely not.
I mean, it's a big river, but holy cow. During a mission dubbed Ocean Safari 87, the ship and crew performed so well that they were awarded a Special Liberty, which were ways that Navy personnel were rewarded with trips to other parts of the United States. So if they did a good job or whatever, they'd be like, hey, where do you guys want to go? You got a free trip wherever you want to take the ship. Of course, if you want to go to Colorado, might be a bit difficult.
What in the world?
The captain at the time was a native of New Orleans, so he decided they would go there for Mardi Gras. So very timely with the episode as well. We've got Mardi Gras coming up here. The Forrestal was there for 4 days and conducted tours for over 40,000 visitors. People got to ride one of her 4 aircraft elevators.
Way!
Mort, get off that thing!
Phooey.
In 1989, the Forrestal was sent on a secret mission off the northwest coast of Puerto Rico. On her second evening there, SEAL Team 6 arrived on the flight deck via 2 helicopters. The team and the crew of the Forrestal then cruised for 3 days to the southwest Caribbean Sea off the Panama and Colombian coasts. SEAL Team 6 then left on their mission. This was so secret we still don't know exactly the purpose, but it was probably one of 2 things. An attempt to capture Manuel Noriega or apprehend Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar. Either one would be a very interesting secret mission to be on.
The end of the USS Forrestal's naval career would come in 1993 after more than 37 years of service. The Navy decided to decommission Forrestal, and this happened on September 11, 1993 at Pier 6E in Philadelphia. In June of 1999, there were efforts to turn the carrier into a museum, and Baltimore put in a bid to have it moved there. But these plans and the funds never came together. Next, there was an effort in 2007 to turn the ship into an artificial reef. But that plan also never came to fruition.
That would have been pretty fun to dive a big super carrier under the ocean.
In 2013, it was announced the Navy was taking bids from companies to scrap the carrier, and All-Star Metals in Brownsville, Texas won. The ship was towed from Philly to Texas by a team of tugboats, and by December 2015, she was no more, save for her stern plate that was saved and restored, and is on display at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. The ship's anchors were given to the U.S.S. John C. Stennis during refueling and complex overhaul in July of 2023.
Shortly after the big fire, not all those other little ones, but the big fire, crew members claimed that secured hatches would open and close on their own. Shadow figures and apparitions were reported. Sometimes sailors would hear weird, garbled voices on the intercom phones, and disembodied moaning was also heard. Public Relations Officer Lieutenant James Brooks sent out a news release in 1988, and he wrote, "Whatever, or whoever it is, crew members swear ghosts are responsible for the flickering lights, voices on disconnected phones, and all things that go bump in the night. Incredibly, when performing their duties below deck, men adamantly claim that they've seen ghosts." This is the Public Relations Officer, a military member, and he's doing this as a news release, a press release, out to the papers.
I love it.
Yeah, I do too. In that news release, Brooks also featured a photograph of a disembodied pair of khaki slacks entering a hatch. Brooks claimed that the photo featured George the Ghost, who had been haunting the carrier for at least 3 years. No one is sure who exactly George may be. Some claimed he was a pilot who died in 1986. The name George is also said to have come from the ship's former food officer who died during the fire in 1967. He is seen as a full-bodied apparition in a khaki uniform, so people believe he had to have been an officer or chief petty officer. People have also claimed to be pushed, woken up from their sleep by something they couldn't see, and things have been thrown around. And of course, that's not a current thing anymore, but back in the day when that press release in 1988 came out.
Petty Officer 2nd Class Gary Weiss saw a khaki-uniformed man passing through the holds and realized it was a ghost when it disappeared from an area that had no exit. Weiss and another crew member were working in the freezer when they heard a disembodied voice say, "Hello, shipmates." They stopped what they were doing and looked at each other. They knew neither of them had said that, and there was no one else around. Weiss had also heard unexplained footsteps and saw supplies and food go flying.
Hey, who's throwing those eggs at people?
Don't be throwing no eggs.
I
They're
know.
too
Too
expensive.
expensive for that. Have you noticed? Nobody's egg in a house these days.
That's true.
That's one way to keep them from doing it.
We love our eggs. They're good brain food.
It's just like during COVID, I'm sure there was no TPing going on because toilet paper was a hot commodity.
You're right.
Petty Officer Dan Balboa was in charge of the officers' mess, and he said that crew members avoided the freezer storage lockers for years after the fire because they'd been used as, they got to use freezers for the bodies, so temporary morgues, and they got weird feelings in there. Balboa said that one cook refused to go in the freezers and asked to be transferred off the ship because he saw the ghost of someone he knew. He also said, "I've sure heard some strange sounds when down there. One night when I was below taking inventory, I heard the heavy steel deck grating being lifted and slammed back down several times. Yet each time I turned around to investigate the sound, nothing was there. Another time I was checking the freezer's temperatures and all of the doors that I had just latched reopened by themselves."
Stan Shimborski was a welder who was working to dismantle equipment in the freezer storage area in 1993. He told reporters, "I no sooner got down to work when I heard this loud clanging noise. I think it's another worker down there. I get out my wrench and I clang back. Clang, clang. A few seconds later, I hear this return clang. Clang, clang. For the heck of it, I clang again.
Clang, clang went the trolley.
Clang, clang. Again, a few seconds. Clang, clang. Finally, I decided to see who it was that was returning my clangs. Leaving my work, I go through the doors, and at the end of the long room is the figure of a horribly burned chief petty officer, just staring at me. Then, he slowly faded away. Needless to say, I got out of there fast."
Oh, he didn't want to play the clang clang game anymore? I think that would do it for me too. If I'd be like, "Okay, dude, what are you doing? Are you just fooling around? What in the heck?" M.C. Farrington wrote on the Hampton Road Naval Museum blog about some experiences with George he had heard from fellow crewmates on the Forrestal. He wrote, "The sailor working closest to me claimed that he had had an experience with George. He had been working with one other man at the bottom of a vertical access trunk that terminated at 2 reefer spaces, and I have no idea what any of that means. They'd just finished filling up one reefer and had just opened the hatch leading into another empty one. One new problem that developed was that they could not get the lights in the space to turn on, but a much worse problem quickly became apparent. Despite having to traverse a further 25 feet to place the boxes along the opposite bulkhead of the newly opened space, the petty officer overseeing the work above had refused to send down any more men to bridge the gap. The man at the end of the chain would have to quickly run each new box across the reefer from the entrance after receiving it from the second to last man, the teller of the tale, at the bottom of the trunk. Meanwhile, a box continued to come down about every 5 seconds. So I envision you've got Lucy and Ethel sitting at the chocolate
Oh, gosh.
conveyor belt,
Yeah.
and all the chocolates start coming really fast and they start shoving them into places. So this guy's like really having to haul butt, I'm assuming, to get to the boxes as they're coming down. Despite the new challenges they were facing, the sailor at the doorway tried to keep up with the pace. After handing off the first box to the sailor inside the darkened space, he pivoted upward to catch the next box being handed down from above, but he was shocked when a pair of hands emerged from the pitch-black doorway and grabbed it from his hands when he pivoted downward again. After the following box dropped into his hands, he pivoted back down to the sailor who was again back in the doorway and asked him, "How'd you do that?" as he handed over the box. "How'd I do what?" the man replied breathlessly. "How did you get back here so fast?" "I got back just now." "No, you grabbed the last box just a few seconds ago and now you're back again." "No, I didn't. I just got back." Meanwhile, more boxes were coming down the access trunk unabated, so the two had to put their argument on hold. Yet neither of them were able to keep up the pace after that, nor were they ever able to sort out just what had happened. Neither could I, after hearing the tale that day down at the bottom of a similar trunk near a similarly dank, dark reefer space. But there's one thing I did know. George is supposed to be an officer, a khaki, right? "That's what I heard," replied the sailor. "Then it can't be George," I said, "because no khaki, living or dead, would ever come pitch in all the way down here." So basically he's saying no officer would have been helping out. The YouTube channel Snarled shares a story from one of their followers. In the 1970s, a sailor had gone down below to an area where they stored tools, and this was a dark and cluttered space. I imagine it's probably something similar to what we just described. Most sailors didn't care to make supply runs here. He saw a man out of the corner of his eye watching him from across the room. When he turned to look at the man, there was no one there. The sailor quickly grabbed the tool he had come down for and hurried back up to where his mates were working. He didn't say anything to anybody. A little while later, this same sailor was making his way through one of the carrier's long corridors when he smelled smoke. He even started coughing. That's pretty intense. You're not just smelling it, but it's making you cough.
Right.
He then saw a man running towards him wearing a sweaty and sooty white t-shirt. When the man looked up, the sailor could see that the man was toothless and his eyes were sunken. This thing, that's what I'm going to call it, then reached for the sailor and passed right through the sailor. The sailor again didn't tell anybody. He's of course thinking, people are going to think I'm nuts. For weeks after this, he kept experiencing strange things like that smell of smoke with no fire, disembodied laughter, and boxes that would tip over by themselves. Just before his tour ended, he and his friend named Bruce were bringing an engine part up to the deck when they saw 4 men on the deck engulfed in flames, and they watched as the men jumped into the water. The sailor and Bruce quickly put down the engine part and dived into the water to help the men. The sailor reached one of the men, and when he grabbed his hand, it was ice cold. They noticed that none of the burn victims looked human. They had charred skin that was barely there. The sailor and Bruce were pulled up out of the water by the other sailors, and there were no other men found in the water. The sailor and his friend Bruce then compared notes and realized that they both had been having paranormal experiences but had been too scared to share them with each other.
Wow.
So I'm like, wow, a lot of people, if you have one experience, that's pretty amazing. This sailor was having stuff happen all the time.
Must have been sensitive. Tomcat Tweaker posted on Reddit, "Forrestal was super haunted. I knew the reputation and was pretty excited at the chance to see something when I saw I was going to spend some time on her."
So clearly this is something that was getting around the Navy.
Clearly. "I was on her for 2 weeks and had the 0 to 0400 hangar watch twice during that time. And saw stuff each time.
That is during the witching hour."
Once I saw a pair of trucks get kicked out from a wheel. About pissed straight down my bell bottoms. Scared the piss out of them.
You did.
I probably didn't move for 30 minutes trying to justify what I saw. The other time, like 3 nights later, I saw a guy sitting on a wing, swinging his legs for like 5 seconds. He wasn't there, then was, then wasn't.
So here's another guy having multiple experiences. There's nothing that demonstrates military power better than an aircraft carrier. If you've never been aboard one, we highly recommend the experience. USS Forrestal suffered many tragedies, but she served our nation well through the decades. One is left to wonder what became of her ghosts. Was the USS Forrestal haunted?
That is for you to decide.
So now I would like to do some investigating around that stern that's in Pensacola and see if you get anything.
Definitely.
And then we have anchors that made it onto another ship. Did that carry any spirits with it? Because sometimes they do get attachments with parts of ships like that.
That is true.
And maybe a lot of these crew members would be kind of upset that their ship was destroyed.
Yeah.
I always hate to hear that a ship has been dismantled and such, but I mean, you can't keep them all, I guess. Where would we keep all of them?
That's true.
We know what we'd love to keep for you guys. Keep you looking at our website at historygoesbump.com. And if you guys would like to send us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com or any of our various social media. We'd love to have you subscribe to the show either on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you have an opportunity to review us, we would greatly appreciate it.
Yes, indeed.
I want to thank you guys for tuning into this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now. Bye-bye. This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Dispatches from the Grave Digger.
We want to welcome into the graveyard Stephanie O'Gwyn. We're going to be burying you under an obelisk headstone.
Thank you so much for supporting History Goes Bump. We really could not produce this show without our executive producers.
All right, the episode is over, but don't go anywhere. There's bloopers at the end, because these two lasses find it difficult to read a script.
Are you ready to rumble?
No.
Oh.
I'm ready to rumble.
The Allied victory of the Guadalcanal Campaign. Campaign. Can we have some champagne with our campaign?
It's too early to break out anything alcoholic.
Oh, all right.
The Forrestal was followed by 7 big deck conventionally. I can't stop laughing now.
Big deck. What are you saying that sounds like, Kelly?
Don't leave that in.
I will at the end.
Don't! No!
King Hussein of Jordan was one of the first dignitaries to visit the carrier and...
Sounded like you said dignitaries.
Ding! Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling.